I'm so pleased to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, Eric, and I'm really looking forward to the next couple of days. So my task today is to talk about best practices for socializing macaques, and I've just put the keyboard away. So in primates, in all animals, the optimal captive management should rely on the way the animal lives in the wild. So we can presume that the physical and the social environment in which the animals live in the wild will best support their well-being. So therefore, the optimal way of housing macaques is to give them large and complex physical and social environments. And the three most salient features of macaque social organization that we need to remain aware of is that they form female-bonded troops, that males transfer between groups at sexual maturity, and therefore you have these families of related females within each group, and that all relationships are governed by a very strict linear dominance hierarchy. So there are management challenges associated with forming and maintaining these large groups, and we need to be guided by their social organization. However, in the laboratory, this is commonly the environment for captive macaques, cages and cages and cages. Hopefully, a lot of these animals are socially housed. A lot of them are singly housed. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I don't want to talk like that. And so one of the ways that we can make this environment more closely meet their needs is to provide them with social housing. So moving singly housed animals into a social setting is a major aspect and effort of strong behavioral management programs. Single housing does not meet their needs. A nice illustration of this is what you can catch monkeys, singly housed monkeys, do when we're not in the room, and that is to strain to make contact with strangers that they've never met. They can't see them, and to make your hand available to someone that you don't know takes some bravery in this species. Okay. I keep wanting to close the keyboard drawer. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the topic of pairing in caged macaques, specifically rhesus macaques for the most part. I'm going to be talking about pairing adults, and I'm going to be talking about same-sex pairings, because that's commonly what we are able to do in a laboratory environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of forming pairs and then about managing pairs in a laboratory environment. So first, as far as introducing rhesus macaques to one another, there are an enormous number of methodological issues that we need to get a better handle on so that we can optimize our techniques. I'm not going to even try to touch many of these, both because there's no time and because I don't know anything about some of these. But one of the things I'm going to talk about is determining prospective partners. Obviously, when you have a choice of whom to pair, and sometimes you don't. I mean, in a lot of research projects, you have no choice, so you're introducing whom you can. But sometimes you have a choice, so you want to pick animals that are the most likely to become a compatible pair. And there are a number of different tools we can use to try to achieve this goal. There are studies where temperament can guide these decisions, temperament of the animals, not of the people. And a lot of principles that we all adhere to, like not matching weights very closely. It's generally thought to be better to have different weights in prospective pairs. And one of the things that I'm trying to learn from is our practical records on our social introductions. So back when I was starting doing this, like in my 30s, I set up spreadsheets for my staff to fill out to document all the introductions that they did. And back then, the sheet, you could probably look at it on one monitor. But over time, we kept adding column after column after column as we developed questions about how to refine our methods, and decided to look at it in a systematic way to try to answer questions. So there's a lot of just regularly occurring variability in the contexts in which we introduce animals, for instance. And so we can do retrospective assessments and try to learn more about selecting pairs. So I'm going to give you just one example, and that is the issue of whether or not prolonged prior use is useful. It makes perfect sense to say, well, these animals have been able to see each other since they've been able to see each other for a while. They're familiar with each other. They may have actually worked out their dominance relationship, so then they're not going to have any colorful discussion about it when they're in the same cage together. So this may be a very advantageous thing to do. We want to try to pick pairs that have been able to see each other. But it also makes sense that animals may have developed antagonistic relationships with other animals. And these guys know that that other guy can't get at them. So they basically can be as obnoxious as they want, as often as they want, because that guy can't get at them. But so if one day it can, you may have a bad outcome. It's kind of like a road ragey kind of a thing. So, those both make some sense. So we started recording whether or not the guys we were pairing happened to have been able to see each other for a while. And we found that prior view tends to be associated with poorer outcomes. So it looks like that road rage thing is perhaps a more realistic issue to be thinking about. So lower success rates and higher rates of wounding. So that's one way that different people have different, common sense leads them to different beliefs, and we can start to study those, get information on those beliefs if we're keeping crazy huge introduction records. So that's just one example about one of the columns on my poor staff's sheet. I'm going to go quickly through the pair introduction process. Every facility has different methods. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I'm just going to kind of walk you through what we do and what is a fairly common general methodology. So the first step in pairing rhesus macaques is often to put them in protected contact, it's called, or partial contact, or grooming contact. So the animals are placed in adjacent cages, and they're separated by barriers that permit social interaction, but not entry into the other's cage. And then after the animals have lived like that for a while, then you remove the barrier or open the door, and then animals have access to each other's cages and are fully introduced in the same space. So now I'm going to show you a little video, and I couldn't get PowerPoint to let me insert the video, so I'm going to hop back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to just show you what some of this stuff looks like. So here are some macaques grooming through. I wanted to have sound, but I forgot to figure out how to do it. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. So this is one thing that we see through the panel. So this is through the protected contact barrier before we open that door. So nice grooming. Another thing that we may see is presenting and mounting. Mounting in rhesus macaques can often be a affiliative, relationship cementing, or alliance building process. And you could see that this is extremely constrained, but they're still able to have that interaction with one another, and then they settle down to groom. Another thing that we will see, brace yourself, is fighting. So here's some guys going at it. There's a lot of bluff involved, but they are trying to bite each other's fingers, and animals do get wounded through protected contact. So that's another thing that we see. Oh boy. No way. I guess I need some help. I don't know what I could have done. Oh, yeah, touch screen to activate. Yeah, okay. So then you open the door, and I'll show you one of the things you see when you open the door. Unfortunately, there's no sound, which I really wanted you to hear the sound so that you could kind of see what's going on with these animals. But Eric offered to make some vocalizations, but perhaps he'll hit, you could at least hit the cowbell, for real. I'm not kidding, hit the cowbell. Okay, so they're hearing a lot of noise, and one of them runs to the other for support and requests to be groomed. So this is just a nice little example of the social buffering that is provided with full contact social housing. So you see why I wanted the bell, just to kind of show that the animal's agitated by noise and needs some comfort. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. No. Okay, so the holy grail of everything that my staff does is to try to be able to predict, to divine the outcome of an introduction from early interactions. We want to be able to stop an introduction that's going to fail as early as possible so the animals don't go through unnecessary stress or get wounded. This is, I touched it. So this is something that we would all like to be able to do. And you know, when people are introducing macaques, they're often in the room. They're not generally this close, but just for photographic reasons, she's standing right there. And everybody watches the introduction and takes a lot of notes on what's going on. But I asked my staff to not increase the monitoring that they were doing. We leave animals unmonitored, so we watch them, for instance, for the first half hour, and then a number of 5-minute sections over the day for the first several days, etc. So keep doing what you're doing, but do it systematically. So use a check sheet and simply record whether or not you saw certain kinds of interactions while you were monitoring. And so what we were looking for is useful predictive behaviors. And so I've got 3 scenarios here. The first 2 are not useful. The first one is not useful because you can see the 2% on the bottom represents the proportion of introductions in which we ever see that interaction during monitoring. That doesn't mean they're only doing it in 2% of the introductions, of course. It's just what are my staff seeing with the standards that we have for monitoring. And it looks like it's quite predictive of success because when it's observed, a large proportion of those introductions are successful. That's what the green bar represents, in comparison to the mean success rate. So that would be a really good sign, right? But the problem is, if we're only seeing it extremely rarely, it's not useful to us. And when we do see it, the likelihood of sampling error is such that we can't really draw good conclusions. The second behavior is seen half the time, so that's pretty useful. But the proportion of introductions in which it's seen doesn't vary much from the mean success rate, so that's not really telling us much either. What we want is behavior 3. Happens a lot, and it is successful. It's seen in successful introductions at a very different proportion than the mean rate. So this third behavior is the kind of behavior that we are looking for. So now brace yourself. I'm going to show you a bunch of green line graphs, but I'll go through them quickly. So first, let's look at females. In the first day of protected contact, there are no behaviors that are occurring often enough and also predict a good outcome. But there were several behaviors that predicted a poor outcome. Surprisingly, one of them is touching, just reaching through and non-aggressively touching their new social partner. That's, I guess, not a good idea to do. Maybe that's rude. And then the other behaviors are aggressive behaviors, threat behavior, lunging, or actual fighting. And, no big shock, that's not predictive of a good outcome. But it's really, really important to look at this graph and keep it in your mind that look at the proportion that are successful, even when you see these behaviors. So this illustrates the problem of pulling the plug too soon. A lot of people start to see fighting and close that door right then. to protect the animals, which of course is the right attitude, but you're going to end up with animals that could have been pair housed living alone because you pulled the plug too soon. Okay, now we're looking again at females in the first day or two of full contact. Very little emerges in the first day. It's just in the subsequent days that we start seeing behaviors that are very predictive, if not practically guarantee a good outcome. And they're kind of interesting. One is relaxed proximity, just sitting near each other, and that kind of stands to reason, but not everything that stands to reason to us turns out to be true. Another behavior that is very predictive is co-threatening. And I've got a little video of that. So what you'll see is the animal on the right is directing threat stares and then repeatedly glancing back at his new social partner, who mounts him, showing the kind of alliance type behavior, and then they jointly threaten the either another monkey or a human or an observer. So my staff are always really happy when the monkeys threaten them together, because that's a really good sign. So, yay, they don't like me. Okay, so that's co-threatening. What? I don't know how to do this. This is going to get to be a longer and longer process as I screw up slide by slide. All right, in the males, it's pretty interesting because there are tons of behaviors that happen fairly often and predict success. In the males, we see this co-threatening behavior happen quite early. So this is the first day of protected contact. They can't even get in each other's cages, and they're threatening us together, yay. They'll ask each other to groom, like you saw in that video. That's one of the ways you ask for grooming. Now, touching is still a little bit rude, I guess. Fear grimacing is a positive sign, which makes perfect sense. We want to see that because that's like saying uncle. That's saying, okay, we're done with this struggle for rank. And then, not shockingly, aggressive behaviors are not a good sign, but again, look at the proportion that end up being successful if you do allow them to have these interactions and then continue on with relationship formation. And so then in the days of the first couple days of full contact, we're seeing consistently the value of co-threatening. We finally got grooming showing up. Everybody's always looking for grooming, of course. And then relaxed proximity as well. Okay. So now I'm going to turn to comparing some methodological techniques at a number of different facilities. So this was the first time I kind of tried to do this, and I work at a very large primate center, and so I and several colleagues that work in somewhat similar centers put our heads together and compared our introduction records. And I thought that I was really excited about this. I thought we could pluck out some really, really useful, clear information that could guide us into how to do this better. But brace yourself. So the three methods that were used, the first one was a three-step method. So the first step in an introduction was the use of a clear panel between animals next door to each other. And this would be like for an hour or at most a day. Then protected contact was employed, and then the door was opened. Another facility did not use the clear panel, but used the steps that I showed you just now. And then two facilities, instead of using a clear panel and instead of using a panel that permits some contact, used mesh panels, again for a couple days maybe. So these are really just visual access panels. They can't have any real degree of meaningful contact, maybe fingertip. So they used this fine mesh and then went directly to full contact. So they had no stage of free ability to perform contact social behaviors with each other. And here's where you brace yourself. What I found was kind of a mess. the blue bar represents the facility that used clear panel. Red is the one that only used protected contact. And then the green and purple bars are the two facilities that did things broadly similarly. So the success rate for both males and females was lower in the facilities that were using protected contact. So that raises the worry that they were screening out animals that might have been successful. That's purely speculation, but it's just one of the things that I think of when I look at this. The facility that used just mesh, so no protected contact whatsoever, had the highest success rates. The other facility that used mesh had a very different definition of success, so they had to have seen grooming in order to deem an introduction successful. And you can see from my previous slides that there is a potential problem with that you may just not catch them grooming, but they may be forming a positive relationship. So I think that's what's responsible for this huge difference between the two facilities that used mesh. But again, speculation. It's interesting to see that the variation in success rate among males was very different, so much more different from between facilities than among the females. So it may be particularly important that we peg the best way to introduce males. Now we're looking at wounding, and this is wounding that results in the veterinarian deciding to anesthetize the animal for close examination of a wound. They may or may not treat the animal. And we thought this was a really good threshold for calling a wound as a wound is a wound. Gosh darn it. Touch screen to activate. Okay. If this doesn't happen to anybody else, I'm really going to freak out. So what jumps out at us, of course, is the higher wounding level in males at the facility that used protected contact. So the facility that used both clear and protected contact, cool. But the place that didn't screen with a clear panel, 1 out of 10 males was anesthetized for examination. When we talked more about this and we dug more into the situation, it became apparent that trying to make sure that we were looking at the same severity of wound by defining a significant wound as requiring anesthetization was not as good as we thought it would be, because there's really wide variation in how vets deal with wounds. So in some facilities, they would tend to, at most, administer like a long-lasting pain relief to the animal, but not take it out, not anesthetize it to take a look at it. And then other facilities were very wont to take an animal out, you see blood, and then you take the animal out and take a look at it. So that's one of the frustrations of doing this. You know, we try to be comparing apples and apples, and we're not. But this just does suggest that using a visual-only stage may result in lower levels of wounding. We have to worry because then we might have fewer animals socially housed than there could be, but we may be keeping particularly the males safer if we're using a non-contact setting to screen out, to choose not to move forward to contact setting. So, you know, this is so frustrating. I'm telling you about this even though it's frustrating and I don't think it's all that informative. I don't think you should run home and do it one way or another way. But I think it really illustrates the challenges of doing this kind of comparative assessment. I think it's really important to do, but it really is a complicated, difficult thing to do in an effective way. In addition to the veterinary approaches to wounding that I was just mentioning, there's also very different tolerance levels among people for aggression. And we can't control for that without making, you know, predetermined rules across centers. And this was retrospective, so of course we couldn't do that. And then tolerance of wounding. Some veterinarians are comfortable with wounding that doesn't require suturing, for instance, not necessarily leading to the termination of the introduction attempt. So this is so difficult because we have these uncontrolled confounds. We have different metrics like what is a successful introduction and what level of wound requires veterinary intervention. Retrospective stuff is also such a problem because you get into circular reasoning problems. So for instance, if you perceive an introduction to be more risky, you may take a slightly different approach. And then if you were right that it was a risky introduction and it fails, then it makes it look like that approach was a bad idea, was associated with bad outcomes. So we have to be really conscious of that, sort of the restraint on our ability to draw conclusions from retrospective assessments. And it's very difficult to do this kind of stuff because the people that are introducing the animals and everyone who's caring for the animals is looking out for them a great deal and very motivated to want to do the right thing. And so it's difficult to tell people rigidly do something completely different because these are not scientists or research technicians. These are the people that are serving the animals. And a facility and individuals all have their own sense of risks and benefits and are making independent decisions. So what we really need, of course, are prospective studies and controlled experiments. But nonetheless, I still believe that it's a really smart thing to do to have hideously wide introduction spreadsheets so that you can mine some of this information. All right, so now we've succeeded. We have some compatible pairs, and we are managing them in a laboratory context. So we know that there are sweeping benefits of pair housing for caged macaques. Just in terms of the behavioral benefits, we know that it provides for a broader range of species-appropriate behaviors. It reduces undesirable behaviors like abnormal behaviors and high levels of anxiety-related behaviors. It makes them more active and buffers them from stressful events like I showed you before. But in a laboratory environment, not all of the animals are going to be housed in full contact continuously. They may be housed in intermittent contact, or you might want to call it interrupted contact, where they're separated and reunited on a frequent basis, or that intermediate stage in introductions, that protected contact may be implemented long term. Now, why would you want to do that? When animals are being used on research projects, the fact of the matter is that they are separated and reunited on a frequent basis on a lot of studies because one or both animal has to be removed from the caging for anything from cognitive testing to anesthetization for a procedure, and then they're reunited. So this is happening as a consequence of the research. And then there are some people that have been using it as a management strategy. So they were reasoning that, well, these are animals that are in a confined space. They're xenophobic. They do fight. So it's nice to give them a break from each other. So they were separating animals on a regular basis for that purpose. As far as protected contact, it is a really good tool for providing some social housing to animals on research projects that would otherwise have to be housed singly. So just one example would be for collection of feces from known animals or animals that are on different feeding schedules. And then we get to sort of management-related issues. You could argue that protected contact might in a way be superior to full contact, particularly in the kind of confined spaces that we're talking about, that we're often restricted to in research. Obviously, this is a great way of providing choice and control. The animals choose whether to interact. You can get away from someone who's being aggressive to you. It may reduce anxiety both for that reason and because you're not being introduced and separated and reunited all the time, which may require animals to renegotiate relationships or be disruptive. So rather than use intermittent contact, you might want to use protected contact. Maybe it's safer. So again, back when I was young, like 30 years old, I really thought this might be the way to go. And we certainly could get a lot of animals in some sort of a social setting quicker if we left them in protected contact, since that's an intermediate step in the introduction process. So just as far as using resources and making progress for as many animals as quickly as possible, this seemed like it might be a good idea. This was before the USDA draft policy that clearly outlined that protected contact was an inferior form of social housing, and now with the guide that has the same stance. And it also was illustrated to me as a mistake. So I conducted a research project in which I collected behavioral data on singly housed animals, and the levels of behavior are represented in the black bars, introduced them into full contact, which is the white bars, housed those same pairs in intermittent contact for a couple of months after 6 weeks to acclimate to that setting. And then housed them in protected contact, which is the darker gray bars. And I say then this, then that, but it was done in counterbalanced order between animals. So if you compare the black and the white, you can see these lovely drops in abnormal behavior, anxiety-related behavior, and inactivity, and an increase in locomotion. So these are all great demonstrations, metrics of improved well-being. For all these behaviors, it looks as if intermittent contact isn't interfering with that benefit. But then when you look at protected contact, you see this U shape to these undesirable behaviors. So it's popping back up towards single housing levels, abnormal behavior, anxiety-related behavior, inactivity. The one sort of exception to this is with respect to abnormal behavior, it's still, there's a trend towards it being lower than single housing. So it has some beneficial effect, but certainly less than the other forms of pair housing. And then as far as female social interactions, okay, I didn't have to go back to the beginning and learning. So there are no black bars here because these animals didn't interact much when they were in single housing. We can see that with the females, that levels of affiliative behavior were actually higher in intermittent contact, but I only collected these data when the animals were together. So essentially they're squeezing more friendly interaction into a shorter period of time because they're separated some of the time. But look at these depressingly low levels of affiliation in protected contact. These guys just aren't taking advantage of what we're trying to provide to them. It's great that we're seeing lower levels of agonistic behavior, which is aggression or rank-related behavior, but look at the cost that it imposes. Now with males, things are not quite as clear-cut. In this population of males, we saw no effect of any of these changes in housing on abnormal behavior. In larger samples we have, but not in these guys. But in anxiety-related behavior, the same U shape. With respect to inactivity, here's an example where the benefit of full contact was not obliterated in protected contact. So that's one good thing about protected contact for males. And then as far as social interactions, we see kind of the same thing. They're just not talking through the panel. They're not fighting, which is great. I do note that they are having more agonistic interactions in intermittent contact. But these are animals, this was agonistic behavior that didn't result in wounding, that didn't require separation, and involves those same animals that, remember, had lower levels of anxiety-related behavior. So I think I'm fairly confident in saying this wasn't really a problem for them, these particular animals, but it may be something that people want to keep an eye out for if they are having to house males in intermittent contact. So I think just from the study, I feel fairly confident in asserting that intermittent contact, at least when the animals are paired, confers most of the same benefits as continuous full contact. However, protected contact is clearly inferior to both those other forms of social housing. But the situation gets a little more complicated. I work with rhesus macaques. We don't have many or any long-tailed macaques much of the time. But I did a collaborative project with one of my colleagues that did have a large colony of long-tailed macaques. They're also called cynomolgus macaques or crab-eating macaques. And she housed them in protected contact and in full contact as well. So we decided to compare our results. We only had data for females. And we wondered if the situation would be different because there are some trends in behavioral differences between these two closely related species. And we wanted to see how that played out in terms of social housing. So we didn't have comparable data on single housing, but we did on the animal's behavior in protected contact and full contact. So the first point was in neither species was there evidence that long-term protected contact housing was superior in its behavioral benefits to full contact, which I had already gleaned from the research that I had done, but it was possible that maybe that was different in long-tailed macaques, but it wasn't. So that idea that I had way back when I was young was wrong, still wrong. We saw undesirable effects, such as less social grooming, like we saw in my study, higher levels of abnormal and anxiety-related behaviors, as in my study, but we didn't see these effects in the long-tailed macaques. So, everything I'm telling you, we have to be so careful not to generalize it to other species. We can't make assumptions that males are going to behave in the same way as females. Different ages may differ, rearing may differ. Different panel designs of protected contact may influence results. And so I think we're all really conscious of that, but the idea that we're going to see really different things in a super closely related species, genus, is kind of depressing. It indicates even more that we have such a need for more research to be done on managing macaques in pairs in a laboratory environment. So when I was, how bad am I? I'm going to make it. So when I was preparing this talk, I was starting to get discouraged, and I was thinking, all I'm going to be doing is telling folks what we don't know yet. But there are a couple of tidbits, at least some kind of tentative tidbits, but some things that come out of the information that I'm showing you. I think the fact that female-female introductions may be a little bit more cryptic than male-male introductions is an important thing to note. And that's a useful thing to note, too, because a lot of people are hesitant to even try to introduce males, consider them unpairable. They may cite the behavioral exemption and not even try to pair them. But at least I think my evidence suggests that they'll at least tell you what they think of each other better than the females. So there may be more promise for predicting outcomes and hopefully separating them before you have a significant poor outcome. I think the data that I showed you suggests that basing your introduction decisions very rigidly on the observation of affiliated behavior or agonistic behavior may not be wise, because you may end up with more animals singly housed than you would have if you looked at other cues that are seen during regular monitoring and are predictive of success. So those behaviors of relaxed proximity and co-threatening may be really good things for people to have on their radar when they're monitoring social introductions. Prior long-term visual access may be a problem, but short durations of visual access at the beginning of a social introduction may have uses, including the reduction of wounding. But like I said, we have to be judicious in our use of visual access panels. A couple more tidbits. Intermittent contact may be associated with increased aggression among males, but in general, it doesn't detract from the benefits of sustained pair housing. I'm not advocating that you use that for management-related reasons, but if you need to use that for research-related reasons, it's nice to know that you are supporting well-being in at least a similar way as you would as if they're pair housed. But protected contact confers relatively little benefit beyond the opportunity, the choice for social interaction, reduced aggressive behavior. But I don't want to state the case too strongly because protected contact does have some benefits. I mean, they are at least able to groom without jamming their hands out of cages if they're small enough to be able to do that. And there are some behavioral benefits by a couple of measures seen of this form of housing. But it's clear that we've got to comply with a practice. We've got to follow a practice of reviewing any institutional animal care and use committee protocol-related justifications for intermittent and particularly for protected contact housing as rigorously as we scrutinize requests for single housing, which may seem like an obvious point, but there are facilities that weren't asking scientists to justify if they wanted to use these other forms of social housing. But the last point I want to leave you with is, we want to know what the best practices are for introducing macaques into pairs. But I'm really interested in figuring out how we can learn what those practices are. And it's very challenging, which is kind of a common thread in this little talk. I've talked about the value of having systematic recordings during the implementation of social introductions. You should have kick-ass intro records. We need to do more sharing of our introduction records, not only what we're recording, but what our findings are. So I know in talking to my colleagues, I already have a ridiculous spreadsheet, but there's always something that somebody else is keeping track of that I hadn't thought of. So I think sharing that will be a really good practice for us all moving forward. We need more cross-facility comparisons, despite the frustrations that I mentioned, including developing common metrics. But clearly we need prospective experiments, either full-blown funded research projects, or at least deciding ahead of time how we're going to handle a social introduction to make systematic comparisons between different aspects of introduction techniques. And so we shouldn't rely on, now I'm done, so it doesn't matter. So we can't rely on retrospective assessments because of the limitations that I talked about. And so I just want to put a plug in for doing as much as you can with the effort that your staff are making to do introductions in a systematic way so that we can learn how to better use our practices for pairing macaques. Thanks.